Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Time. It is my pleasure to have Jay Dyer back on the show. Jay, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Tim. How are you?
Great, thanks for coming back on the show. Now, of course, you are the host of Jay's Analysis, jaysanalysis.com. You're also the author of Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. Mm-hmm. And, what you cover in that book, I think is relevant tonight, but what I wanted to talk about tonight, you've done a number of interviews and also some talks analyzing the career and works of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who passed away last spring. And I want to discuss his role in promoting technocracy, as well as technocracy's subsequent implementation through, the government policies, government agencies, the corporations, NGOs, and of course entertainment, like Hollywood or even the Disney Corporation. And maybe we'll discuss a little bit the history of technocracy itself, why it was developed in the 1930s. But anyway, Zbigniew Brzezinski, you've done a few talks on him, his books, and let's talk about Brzezinski. What was he all about?
Well, he was, of course, as I mentioned, a refugee, I guess you could say, not in the sense of refugees flooding Europe, but refugee fleeing Europe from the Soviet era, and his parents were reported at least to be of noble descent from Poland. And so Brzezinski leaving Poland under Soviet occupation, then going to Canada, I think is what kind of, most people agree that propelled his anti-Russian fervor. So Brzezinski was, I think, a natural. So Brzezinski was, of course, fleeing Soviet occupation, and he therefore made a great recruit into the brain trust of the Anglo-American establishment, and it was McGill University, which, interestingly, I never heard anybody else make a connection to MKUltra, and I don't know that there's any direct work that Brzezinski did on MKUltra, but it's interesting that he was at one of those central schools for the MKUltra programs, McGill University, and it's there that he would, I think, be eyed by different people, a potential recruit for CFR type work. And so when he wrote the Between Two Ages, which is the book that kind of predicts a lot of where we'd go in the electronic age, the technocratic age, that was in 1970. It's really this that caught the eye of David Rockefeller, and that's what many books on Brzezinski will discuss, is that, that's why he was fingered for this role. And David reportedly called Henry Kissinger and said, I've got somebody for this new role that we need to start. Or it was either Henry called David or David called Henry, one of the two. And they decided that Zbig would be perfect for the first chairman of the Trilateral Commission in 1973. So it was there that he began, I think, to really do the deep state work. I'm sure prior to that, and he does actually cite Samuel Huntington and people like that. So Brzezinski is in that school of Bernard Lewis and Samuel Huntington. That's people that he learned from, and of course adopted the Heartland theory and studied Alfred McKinder and all that. And I won't rehearse that. I'm sure your audience is familiar with it. But so he takes that approach certainly to geopolitics. But what's unique about Brzezinski are 3 or 4 things. And interesting, I had a pretty heated debate with Kevin Cole over this. But I think I'm pretty correct in stating that it's really Brzezinski that pioneers the electronic and smart application of these technologies of regime change. And so that's what's, I think, the big, well, actually you could argue there are quite a few things in Between Two Ages that are future-oriented and presage a lot of what we're seeing nowadays. So, everybody talks about the weather weapons stuff that's in the footnotes in certain sections of the book. But he also saw all kinds of things like online education, that people would be taking their classes online, that you could basically re-engineer society through the internet. So a lot of people will talk about technocracy and forget that the internet is what he's talking about when he's talking about technocracy. That's probably one of the biggest examples of technocracy that you could think of. So Brzezinski foresaw the important role that the internet would take in everyone's lives, all the way back in 1970. And as I said, that's why I think David Rockefeller saw him as somebody who was very important and crucial for these deep state roles. And of course, we know that he was the national security advisor under Jimmy Carter. And it's in that role that he implemented these other kinds of technologies that I'm talking about related to the newer models of regime change. So instead of those older CIA models of, assassinating Mossadegh or something like, or attempting to assassinate some leader, having a coup against Mossadegh, that model was replaced eventually from the 50s into the more soft power approach. Now, granted, soft power certainly goes back to the old imperial models of the ancient world. But what Brzezinski was so useful at was integrating these models into the usage of technology. And that's what I think you could safely say he's the pioneer of. And so back in the 70s, he talked about the need for an arc of crisis that would stretch, if I recall, from the Balkans, the Caucasus to Middle East to Southeast Asia even. Yeah. There's a great long article by Andrew Gavin Marshall at Global Research that does a really lengthy discussion of what appear to be examples of Brzezinski's arc of crises, all the way from basically bombings all the way back into the 70s, all the way up to the Mumbai bombings, the Bali bombings, and so forth, the London bombings, and how a lot of this really fits with this model that we're talking about from Brzezinski. And if one reads the excellent articles that Vanessa Beeley and Patrick Henningsen have done on smart power, soft power, and you understand Brzezinski's works, and you understand, the examples of stuff like him co-creating with Hamid Gul and Robert Gates, the Mujahideen or / Al-Qaeda freedom fighters in 1978, 79, then you understand basically the whole model of what you see in the world today. So Brzezinski, I think, is the key. And he's you could argue even a little more relevant than Carol. He's a kind of Carol Quigley, but without all the fun, because he's Carol Quigley meets Bertrand Russell with no nonsense, just straight to the point. Here's how we're going to get the technocracy, and certainly towards the middle of Tragedy and Hope, Quigley has a couple really fat chapters that deal with the implementation of technocracy and the AI computers and the military industrial complex and the managerial society that's coming. But Brzezinski, I think, is not just a, Quigley, his history writer, archivist. He's an implementer. And that's the big key here, is that Brzezinski is a point man for not just writing about this, but also implementing these new technologies that will utilize the latest in tech to achieve destabilization, arc of crisis, regime change, et cetera, to really destabilize all of the post World War II Soviet. What it eventually functions to do is to destabilize the Soviet satellites. And so once the Soviet Empire collapses, that was largely, as I said, a result of this arc of crisis technology model that Brzezinski had really dreamt up, and that's why he was so useful to the oligarchs. And so, in many ways, as I said, for praxis, he's more relevant than even a Quigley, you could argue. Quigley will tell you more about the bankers and history, but Brzezinski's going to tell you more about how to understand what you see on CNN. When you see the news talking about a coup here and a destabilization there. Once you really nail down Brzezinski, you can understand what you're watching. So that, I think, is what sums up Brzezinski. And of course, there's other peripheral addendum material that we can talk about with Grand Chessboard and how it kind of predicts 9/11 in subtle ways. It predicts the Ukraine crisis, back in 1998, 97 when he wrote the book that we saw in 2014. So that's what you're looking at. You're looking at a major geopolitical thinker of the caliber, a player, of the caliber of a Kissinger, who's really putting into praxis the ideologies. So he's not just a brains. He's also, he also flies over there in the famous CBS clip, that land over there is yours. God is with you. You will take it back. As he tells the freedom fighters in Afghanistan.
He's sort of Quigley. He's Carol Quigley without the Irish charm.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
But
with all the Bertrand Russell.
Yeah.
Bare bones, atheistic, pragmatic. Just
there's no sentimentalism with him. Now, I discussed Brzezinski with recently and with Joe Atwell, and we were talking about how figures like Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, they're both foreign, right? I mean, and have these distinct accents that they never seem to be able to shed despite years of living in North America. And he seemed to think that those accents themselves were a function of their role in sort of intimidating and Americans, with their PhDs and their positions in academia, that they're the ones with the education, the knowledge, and the wisdom to sort of plan the world, or at least play their part in planning the world. And I always thought it was funny, both him and Kissinger, who were these two huge figures in the late 20th century, and I guess strategizing for the Atlanticist powers. Both of them, had these Germanic accents, almost Prussian, always Polish. Becomes an area of the world where there's real ethnically there's not much difference. European, and how just example once again how America has been conquered by Europeans.
That's an interesting point. I never thought about that. Kind of took it at face value, but they could have, they could have been menacing in their affectation.
Yeah, it was overdone. It was like
interesting.
So I thought that was interesting. Another thing is to what extent I know he's described as sort of a go-for or a lieutenant for the elite, but in playing such a large role in devising strategy for the Atlanticist powers, for the elite powers that are really behind these nation states that are playthings for the globalist. I mean, if you enjoy as much influence as a Kissinger or a Brzezinski, just ask you this, to what extent can they manipulate things themselves? Because they're whispering into the ear of the emperor. And, of course, historically, we know that often those people, the gray eminence, the people whispering in the ears of those who make the decisions, might be able to manipulate things for their own agenda. An example of how, the Cold War might have been waged for the interests that were behind the Atlanticist powers, the Anglo-American Empire. At the same time, his Polish background probably played a big part in his Russophobia, and his. Was he pushing his own agenda here too? I mean,
yeah, I'm sure that does come into play because, as I understand, he was pretty successful in a monetary sense. Obviously, I don't know how wealthy Brzezinski was, but he's got a fairly prominent daughter who has the TV show with Joe Scarborough that Trump caused quite a ruckus with this week. If you saw that tweet talking about her facelift, that was humorous. But yeah, I would imagine that there is, as I mentioned, due to that, fleeing Soviet occupation, as we're told, that there was personal motivation and vengeance involved, perhaps. But all the better for the Atlanticists.
Yeah.
That really fits into the 20th century strategy that we talked about from Quigley, which dealt with, the 20th, the two world wars basically being about the weakening of Russia and Germany. So,
and Poland was there to spark the Second World War, which was Act Two. To kind of lure Hitler into starting another general war in Europe. Although it became a general war when France and Britain declared war on Hitler over his invasion of Poland, which grew out of the
which is what they encouraged.
The Polish corridor. They encouraged Polish intransigence and then did nothing and let Poland get crushed between Russia and Germany. So again, that's another example. Again, then this utilizing that Polish nationalism that had been crushed for almost 200 years between Germany and Russia. And then it became a reason for sparking a world war in the mid 20th century, early 20th century.
What I found so interesting about his writings was a lot of stuff that you wouldn't expect in there. You wouldn't expect there to be. No, I mean, it's kind of been floating around conspiracy circles and sites for a long time, but I don't think that most people would think about weather warfare and electromagnetic frequency warfare as something realistic. Yet it's in the 1970 book by Brzezinski. Mm-hmm. So he was talking about this stuff a long time ago, and all kinds of other things too. I mean, he even kind of starts out talking about, as I mentioned in my talk, the usefulness of cosmopolitan areas and how this really breaks down people's attachment to the land, to agriculture, and that there's a big shift that happens in cultures when they go through the process of industrialization and then modernization and so forth, and that how this impacts the social order. And he sees that model as key to understanding basically what we've seen in history happen to certain regions or nations, right? Quote, first world nations that have gone through the process of moving from agricultural societies to industrial to modern / technological societies. He sees those as microcosm models for the whole of the world. And this is why they're globalists is that they think that the same model is going to happen. And one of the cheap ways that you're going to do that is with the net. The net will make things global. And that will move everyone into this hive mind. And that's why he's a technocrat. That's the central role here of all of this. And the internet is the internet is technocracy. And I mentioned that not to be Luddite or to be overly negative or fear porn oriented, but I mean, we just have to understand that's a fact, and that's what Brzezinski's talking about. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, because as you get removed from the soil, further removed you are from nature, you get further removed from the laws that bind nature, and you forget that those laws still bind you, and that's how you get to transgenderism and these things, right? Because you probably saw the movie Her with and how you notice the cold surroundings, the urban surroundings, the apartment, everything's cold.
Exactly. That's a great point. The aesthetic of the film really betrays the emptiness. And that's really the point of that film is that he's surrounded by human beings who the kind of one-to-one connection and love that he's looking for, is ironically the Amy Adams character, the girl that's sitting there next to him the whole time, and he's fixated on this stupid computer program. But yeah, that's a great example of what Brzezinski's predicting here and what he would like to see implemented. And there's a lot of other interesting interviews that I came across too. John Adams dug up one from I think the 90s from the New York Times or something like that. But in that interview, it's a link with Brzezinski. He goes into things like consumerism and Americanism, and that's also very revealing because it's more modern. It's 25 years after Between Two Ages, and he's saying, look, we're at the point now where America is basically the battering ram to break down all ideologies across the globe. And that's something I've been arguing for a long time. A lot of people take issue with that, and they have a very, they feel that I'm being unpatriotic or being mean or something like that, when all I'm telling you is that Americanism can be used as a tool to destroy other countries and other traditions, not for something better, but for the purpose of the globalists. And Brzezinski says that. He explicitly says that in that interview. He says, Now, obviously, he doesn't give a shit about America. He has no concern about, but he basically says it's a costume that can be worn to spread hope in the sense of, quote, American democracy, which he more or less says is just oligarchical rule. He knows that there's no such thing as actual democracy. And so it's, he explodes the mythology that it's not true. It's, the American patriotism is basically dead. It's been dead for a long time. And so to be, mindlessly pro-American as so many people are and, support the troops and all this kind of stuff, it's really just serving the oligarchical agenda. And Brzezinski is a prime oligarch to show that. He has no qualms about just saying flat out. It's kind of like, I don't remember if it was you or somebody was doing a show, an interview, and they were talking about, I think it was Alan Watt was doing a discussion about Prince Philip, and that they don't really like to give him interviews often because he just oftentimes he'll just state straight out what they want to do. Like but of course I want to see 4 billion people dead, don't you? Don't you want to see everyone dead? Well, the humans are a cancer.
Yeah.
So they don't give him that interview because, he's a little too blunt. And in many ways, Brzezinski is pretty blunt too. He just flat out says that consumerism and Americanism are the means by which you can destroy religion. And that's really kind of a thesis of Between Two Ages, is that the three things that are ideology's dead, religion's dead, nation state's dead, and Marxism now is dead. So all of those are, kind of come and gone. They're ghosts of the past, and we can move into the technocratic age. So hence, Between Two Ages, that's the new transition period that we're going into, is what he's talking about. Yeah,
you talk about of course, the exportation of Americanism and consumerism, materialism abroad. But one thing, it does not result in the material abundance for the rest of the world. That's just the it relies on impoverishing the world through the economic hitman model, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, these things. All of these things that Brzezinski said were great in bringing about this globalization. But before that was successfully done, it had to be applied domestically here in the United States. And here in the United States, you had, through wars and economic crises and then prosperity, the destruction of any ethnic consciousness or identity here, particularly among the white majority. In fact, the bland white majority is sort of a denatured, deracinated conglomeration of the former ethnic groups. We see little bits of it. Little Italy here. There's St. Patrick's Day parade. But even that's been corrupted. But the breakup, ironically, of these urban neighborhoods into suburbia through various social engineering schemes, whether it's the construction of the interstate highway system, or the creation of the 30-year mortgage, courtesy of the federal government, and these things. And this, of course, this coincides with the post-war boom of the Second World War and this explosion in consumption. And this is where you see the sort of this breakdown of any ethnic or religious identity among various ethnic groups. They became white Americans. But the only thing they could really identify with each other would be their consumption habits, whether it's through music, Elvis Presley or the Beatles, or, the hula hoop, jeans, the T-shirt, these things. And so once they lose any ethnic identity, they can easily be manipulated through consumerism, which is what he's talking about here. And this becomes the good life, of course. That's promoted through mass communication, through Time Life, through the Disney Corporation. Sports is a big thing, because sports is now sort of a substitute for maybe tribal or regional patriotisms that might have existed. So now, but that's all part of the corporate monstrosity, because through sports, you can promote all types of social, agendas, engineering schemes. We're seeing with the NFL and the NBA, or transgenderism, these things. So, here again, I'm saying it had to be done here first. We had to be conquered here in the United States before it was exported. So.
Yeah, and Brzezinski was very, I think, conscious of that, because he wore the cloak of liberal many years, being in the Carter administration, then being in the Obama administration. But he also served on various Bush task forces. So there's another character that, transcends the phony left-right dialectic. You can see it pretty clearly. But Brzezinski definitely understood, with his liberal egalitarian face that he wore, you would get the impression that he believed in equalitarianism and so forth. And he would often speak, of Martin Luther King or these platitudes. But at the same time, you have the cold, calculated technocrat who was very explicit about depopulation, very explicit about carbon taxes, and Agenda 21. So Brzezinski was obviously on board with all that. So we know from that his supposed humanitarian model or cloak that he wore was baloney. That was part of the guise that you wear, to be part of the Democrat establishment. And the same goes for the Republican establishment as well. So, I mean, he's picked out by the Rockefellers, right? These are the GOP, right? The GOP are picking out the so-called Democrats to run these big steering committees. And hence Brzezinski's membership, in Bilderberg and various Bilderberg steering committees, and, being even chosen for slicing up Serbia with Wesley Clark and Kissinger on the International Crisis Group, which I've talked about many times. So Brzezinski is not at all a patriot to any group. And so, he's definitely at that level of people who believe that they don't have any ethnic ties. They don't have anything that binds them to any communities. And in fact, Brzezinski, even in Between Two Ages early on, discusses the possibility of different organizations that could be used for mobilizing globalism. And he discusses the Catholic Church because it's one of the few global organizations. So Brzezinski, again, sees these entities not as something real or as bearers of tradition, but just as tools to be moved on the grand chess pieces. So the Roman Catholic Church is, to Brzezinski, the queen piece maybe, and then you have, Al-Qaeda is a pawn piece. It's like the NGOs are a rook piece. That's how he views all this, and race and culture, all of that is just another chess piece, another tool for manipulation. It has nothing to do with any sort of metaphysical verities or universal truths. It's just simply about cold, hard pragmatism, and that's the essence of technocracy, is that it's pragmatic.
And one thing that's important to point out is when you talk about members of the International Crisis Group, these elder statesmen aren't interested in solving problems and stabilizing the world. They believe in stabilizing the world through destabilizing the world, sort of like burning the village in order to save it. They need the world. Yeah, I mean, it's.
He says if America didn't do what it did, we would have anarchy. Well, so in other words, America has to cause anarchy, or else we'll fall into anarchy. But of course, he's saying, that the American world order, the Pax Americana, he says, basically keeps the whole globe in check and into chaos and so forth, so on. But there's also, other interesting aspects to Brzezinski that you might not expect, like his support for the John Mearsheimer book about AIPAC. So he, I think, both kind of like Soros. Excuse me. Hold on a second. Kind of like Soros, he would, at times draw the ire of certain factions like the Israelis, because, Brzezinski doesn't care for nationalism. He thinks that's dead and gone. So in his mind as a technocrat, that I don't think he has any special care or concern for the Israeli state. So I think you could argue that maybe he represents that kind of UN type faction. Brzezinski would be much more favorable towards a United Nations type of model for global government than he would necessarily the Warhawk Bush neocon approach. So he's maybe not necessarily 100%, on board with the neocons, although Gould and Fitzgerald argue that he actually is just a straight up neocon.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. They have a lot more time put into this than I have, but regardless, there can be, I guess, at times, as we've said, disagreements about different approaches, but it doesn't matter because the end goal is still the same. I think Brzezinski views America and Americanism as a cloak that can be shed once the world is ripe for a total technocratic globalism. And in fact, when Brzezinski critiqued Bush, that was his main critique, was that after 9/11, he didn't sufficiently use it for globalism. He used it for too much Americanism, too much patriotism.
Yeah,
not
that's right.
that it was real, but
yeah, but then that's his criticism, is that this inspired opposition.
Yes, right.
Created opposition with China and Russia, and it was their crude methods by going about this, which messed up the plan, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
As opposed to soft power, which is, you don't talk about going in and conquering, invading. You don't talk about human rights and responsibilities to protect and things like that, as opposed to going in and invading a country and imposing a government with hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops. These things. But now,
and that was partly that's his model. Right? I mean, he wants to use his model. He's the father of that in terms of implementing the technology. I realize that, again, empires have used soft power for a long time, but Brzezinski is the real mover and shaker in terms of utilizing technology and what would eventually be the hashtag type stuff.
Yeah.
All of it being collated together. I think you can really point to Brzezinski as a father. Now, there was other figures right after Brzezinski. Joseph, what's his name? That's the sort of the Harvard father of this approach to regime change. There's another guy who's kind of also credited with being the coining the term soft power.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph, I forget his name, but he's one of these Harvard international business type guys. But it doesn't matter. I mean, he's just coining a term that was already the model for doing this in between two ages that lays out the strategy of using all the technologies.
And you've mentioned, of course, Gene Sharp, this harmless academic up there in Boston.
Nonviolent regime change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess this is the invoking democracy and human rights to go in and disrupt foreign governments, foreign cultures, and sort of incorporated it into the Atlanticist fold, I guess.
Yeah, I wish I could remember that. I think it's even called, it's the Harvard model. It's the Harvard model of Joseph. Somebody was one of the professors at Harvard, I think. But yeah, I mean, that they have this down to a science, and that's why they don't really like that, that approach of, Raytheon and Boeing and the guys who might want to just sell tanks and weapons.
Yeah.
They would rather, use their NGOs than the latest anti-ballistic missiles or something like that.
Well, because but an invasion like that expends a lot of weaponry they have to replace. So there's always pressure to go in, with the guns a-blazing, because that destroys a lot of things. You have to rebuild and replace.
And it was Brzezinski. I don't know if Brzezinski personally profited off of it, but I wouldn't be surprised. But it was Wesley Clark, and you've mentioned it, but it was Wesley Clark and others who had interest in the mineral area of Serbia and certain mines there, and that was a big part of the proclamations of Slobodan Milosevic is this evil dictator, and we got to get rid of him. And what do you know? There's all this these environmental problems that we got to solve. But all of that was just a cloak for basically these people divvying up that country. And I think some people have pointed to Madeleine Albright getting a chunk of that too, or something.
She has a big piece. I think it's telecommunications with Madeleine Albright.
Right.
And Wesley Clark, it's mineral rights or something. And of course
Brzezinski was involved in that strategy.
Mm-hmm. And you have, of course, Camp Bondsteel, which is a huge military operation there, which, huge contracts, not to mention I would have to, that's a NATO operation, I think.
Yes,
which means that, and of course, there's a huge human trafficking and drug trafficking stream going into Brussels. And wherever you find a military intelligence operations, you're going to find, human trafficking and explosion of drug trafficking. This also was their chance to, I believe, in the 90s, to then send in former Mujahideen veterans of the Afghan war into the Caucasus region, Chechnya. Also, there was a Chechen civil war that they could stoke. And
there was a kind of hybrid Kosovo Liberation Army, and this was a hybridization of communist Marxism and jihadist philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And Daniel has a great chapter on that, and others too. Engdahl's written on it. A lot of people pointed out.
Sorry, you cut out. That was Daniel Karibko, I think you said?
Daniel Eslin has a chapter.
Oh, Eslin. Also, doesn't Karibko write a book called Hybrid Wars?
Karibko talks about it.
Andrew Karibko.
About it. Yeah. And everybody knows this was a total CIA thing now. It was pretty obvious. And now that doesn't necessarily mean Slobodan Milosevic was a saint, but it's interesting that, he did marshal a lot of support from Serbian Orthodox people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if there couldn't have also been religious motivations involved there as well. But again, I'm not an expert on Serbia, but anyway,
well, I mean, the Congress voted. I mean, the U.S. government, through the U.S. Congress, systematically took Yugoslavia apart because it made foreign aid dependent upon the constituent republics voting to leave, the authority of Belgrade. And so they were literally bribing the other republics to leave, to break apart Yugoslavia.
Because of Soviet influence.
Yeah. This was 1991, 92, 93, 94. And so they were provoking this Balkan War.
Okay,
by promoting secession. And, in this case, the federal government supports secession, I guess you could say.
Oh, right, yeah. And also, funding Al-Qaeda in that region as well.
Yes. And this
is where Putin, I guess, fought his first battles, we're told,
the
Chechen conflict.
And I guess that roughly follow along the fault line that Brzezinski sought to create with the Arctic Crisis. Yeah. Yeah. And,
so, again, we're at a major player here, and I think Patrick made the argument that Brzezinski's probably the most important figure in terms of geopolitics of the last 50 years. That's probably true.
Mm-hmm. What's amazing to me is all the experts, at least the acknowledged experts in geopolitics, are always advocates of constant destabilization, war, and misery. Because it goes back to the whole study of it goes back to geopolitics, goes back to Mackinder, which inherently involves all that. And it's not like.
And you know what this is similar to, that you and I have talked about many times, is the mafia. And the reason I say that is because if you go to Hot Springs, which I've taken 2 trips there, it's really neat. I mean, it's kind of kitschy and cheesy and run down, but this was kind of like Vegas before Vegas was Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
Right around the time that Hot Springs was hopping as a mob region, and it was kind of a safe place where the Dons could meet. And they would go to the baths and stuff like that. But what's interesting is that there's all these neat facts about the mob and the connections that most people don't know about. So Al Capone actually spent a lot of time in Hot Springs. And I know this because I did a tour, which there's a mob museum here, and they'll take you on this tour. There are underground tunnels that were built underneath Hot Springs for various vices to be run. And so the is just a little neat side story. Whenever the FBI or one of the feds or somebody was going to come bust, because of course all the local police were all bought off. So anytime a fed or somebody like that would come in, maybe try to bust somebody, the local telegraph or telephone operator worked for the mobsters, and she would do a signal, and whichever place was going to get busted, all the guys would run down under most of the businesses, by the way, on the strip have secret passageways. And they would run down underneath, and they would run, down the block to some other building through this, because there's a giant underground tunnel underneath the whole city. So this was how they were running vices and all imaginable, anything you could imagine is what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. And Al Capone teamed up with none other than JFK Sr. to run liquor during Prohibition. And the way they did it, this is really neat. Actually, everybody knows about Arkansas because of the water. There's all these giant water aqueducts underneath the ground. And that's why the water is so good. And of course, the Clintons and Rockefellers, they all have a monopoly on all this stuff. Well, the water companies around here, the famous ones that would sell their bottled water, they were actually running moonshine dressed up as bottled water.
Yeah.
So there was all these, but I had no idea that was actually who was running that. It was Al Capone and Joseph Kennedy Sr. That's who was running that out of Hot Springs. So there are all these neat facts if you take a mob tour here, and then of course other mob characters, like there was Madden, who was a mobster from England, who was running a lot of East Coast syndicate stuff, and actually the New York mobsters would come and get advice from this guy, but he just lived in this little normal house out here in the middle of nowhere in Arkansas. And he was running this giant criminal syndicate, hundreds of millions of dollars, and nobody knew this guy. He was just some British guy who, was very unassuming, living out in the country and playing golf all day. So it's literally like something out of the movies. And the reason I say all that is that when you kind of look at the picture of how things worked on the small scale, and when you look at how operations will be run, say, by the FBI to try to bust these people, and how clever the mobsters were in getting around stuff, is what I'm trying to say. Then you can kind of project big picture. Well, the Brzezinskis, these are like just the big mobsters, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
They're the guys who do it to countries.
Yeah, they suborn, as the same way these mobsters would suborn or bribe local officials to control, the levers of power indirectly, so they could, skate away from the law when necessary. The bigger gangster you are, you apply that nationally, like a Meyer Lansky, to the federal government, who had control of Al Capone could never control J. Edgar Hoover. Meyer Lansky could control J. Edgar Hoover because he had photos of him. Mm-hmm. And the same thing applies internationally. Joe Kennedy would parlay the wealth that he amassed through smuggling into eventually going to gambling. I think he owned a casino out there too, in Las Vegas eventually, but also to buy his way into political power.
Yes, and now here's another interesting little tidbit. Do you know who shut down all the gambling in Hot Springs?
Was it Robert Kennedy?
It was the Rockefellers.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So what time frame was that?
This was in the 60s and 70s.
Okay. So, was that Winthrop Rockefeller?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So he campaigned on this anti-vice platform to get rid of the gambling. Now, when he got rid of it in the 70s, he sent all these feds in and these FBI people. That's when Las Vegas really blossomed in the 70s to be kind of the new. I mean, I understand there was people going to Las Vegas before the 70s, but there was a big heyday for Las Vegas in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a big doubt that the Rockefellers were actually interested in stopping vices. Because when you figure out the history of the Rockefellers, they are Arkansas people, and they are connected to Walmart, which is also headquartered in Arkansas.
And yeah,
now
explain Walmart's meteoric rise.
That's how Sam Walton got his Chinese deals. It's from Rockefeller.
So we're going back to the Trilaterals Commission again.
Exactly. now, how does this tie to Brzezinski? Well, who spotted Brzezinski and, recruited him? David Rockefeller.
Yeah. I like you, kid. You got spunk.
But now, see, most people wouldn't connect all that to mafia type stuff, but actually, when you look at, Winthrop Rockefeller coming to power and they knew what they were doing. Because if you go back to Standard Oil and these are serious business people. They know that this is Bible Belt. They're going to campaign on that anti-vice Bible Belt ticket, right? And that's going to dupe everybody, but they don't care anything about. They're not interested.
It's bootleggers and Baptists.
Yes,
and of course that's interesting because you go back to the early part of the 20th century. Is John D. Rockefeller, the senior, the first, is a big promoter of the temperance movement, and that,
exactly.
And
that's what they were saying was. Now that he may have actually had a a temperance type view. I think they were said to be teetotalers. I don't think they really drank.
Yeah, but it had to do with gasoline, I think, at the time. They didn't want to compete.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. Is that there's almost always ulterior motives. It's not because of. It's about business, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and so that's what really gave it its real push. Mm-hmm. At least to the point, it became this sort of this spasm of insanity where they passed prohibition in 1920. Of course, that is an outgrowth of the Lever Act of World War I, where government assumes control of all food, because it has to control food unless the Kaiser comes over and rapes all our women. So that's a sort of ratchet effect, where again you get a war crisis, which the federal government sheds the Constitution. Forget that. We got a war to fight, and that gives all these interests the excuse to go in and pass these laws, which benefit the corporations.
Yes, exactly.
Standard Oil, a good example of one. So,
anytime you see interviews with mobsters, anytime you talk to people who claim to, know mobsters and like that, they always make the statement that the government's the real mafia.
Yeah. Like the Whitey Bulger, right? That.
Exactly. When I did the mob tour at Hot Springs, that was one of the first things that they said was, "You know who the real gangsters are?" Everybody's like, "Oh, the Italians." Well, no, it's the government. They're like, "Why?" They said, "Well, because anytime anybody came, they said the only shootouts that ever happened in Hot Springs was between the feds and the gangsters. It was never gangster to gangster."
Mm-hmm. Yes. I was interested to listen to Kath Austin Fitz talk about this sort of this planning ahead. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Walmart and how the rise of Sam Walton. This coincides with the 1970s and Trilaterals Commission, 1973. Brzezinski is the first head of it. And this opening to China, of course, a few years before with Nixon and Kissinger. That secret visit he makes in the early 70s. Nixon opens up to China. And this coincides with the Rockefellers and the Trilateral Commission. They're thinking decades ahead. I mean, it's, but she was talking about how in the 1990s airports are going through these upgrades and renovations that they were turning airports into shopping malls. And as a businesswoman, she was looking at it saying, "How is this going to work?" Because people don't go to airports to shop; they go to airports to go to some far off place. Take a flight, go somewhere, to either arrive or to leave. They're not there a long time. 9/11 happens. All the security theater. You're stuck at the airport for 3 hours. You're going to shop. It's like they knew it was going to happen.
Oh, interesting. And you. Even though Brzezinski's not a PNAC character, you do have in Grand Chessboard hints and subtle references to, a new Pearl Harbor. That kind of talk So many people have even said that, even Grand Chessboard might suggest, a coming 9/11. And certainly Brzezinski would have known about it, if this was a planned false flag type thing, which I think it was, obviously. So I feel like he probably did know about it. And then again, it's not just 9/11. You also have him laying out the plans for the Ukraine coup all the way in the 90s. And that's, of course, as we learned that when Soros and Victoria Nuland were first putting the billions into the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine was starting back in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And so presumably Soros, presumably Brzezinski would have been involved in that too, because, he's laying the very thing out in Grand Chessboard as to what needs to happen in Ukraine.
Which is funny because that goes talking about the Ukraine and the role that Hitler played for the Atlantis. He was sort of lured into war and also forced to invade Russia and sort of invade Russia and let Russia absorb the punch, and so they could defeat Germany and also weaken Russia at the same time. Well, here we have the United States government in the 21st century promoting Ukrainian nationalism.
Yeah, just like Hitler did, right?
Just like the Germans and Hitler did in World War I and the Second, because they promoted Ukrainian nationalism. And Hitler did that at the same time. The SS battalions, the Ukrainian SS battalions, and here's the U.S. government supporting these, Stefan Banderas, worshiping neo-Nazis. Yeah, because this is another example of going into an area and screwing up with the local politics and the culture and just creating an arena of constant battle, because if you get into the ethnic politics of the Ukraine in the 1930s, you realize that yes, many Ukrainians have legitimate grudges against what they perceived to be Russians, but really were Soviets. Mm-hmm. So what do you do? Well, you join up with the SS. when the Germans invade, because now it's your chance to get at the Soviets, the Russians.
There's a great article by Leonid Savin on the history of Ukraine and Russia, and it being properly part of the Russian sphere of influence.
Yeah.
He talks about the history of the language, which is very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read even Quigley, he talks about how Hitler knew that was crucial to Russia, because that region, the Ukraine region, Crimea region, that is there's a lot of wealth, a lot of resources there.
Yeah, a lot of black, rich soil that isn't, controlled yet. Yeah. And
so that's why it was very important to split that off from the Russian sphere of influence. So it has nothing to do with anybody's, perceived right-wing philosophy or whatever they're duped into believing. Mm-hmm. It's all about what Washington and, NATO want to do there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I just finished an interview with, Guido Preparata about, Conjuring Hitler, his book, about the Anglo-American, agenda to create Hitler in the 1920s and 30s, and how Hitler ultimately served the objective of the Anglo-American, the Atlanticist powers.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, even with the funding, it goes in. There's the Dawes plan, the Young plan, and the money starts pouring in as soon as Hitler becomes comes into power. So you get the German recovery and all the industrialization that's aided and abetted. Not to mention the fact the setting up of the European chessboard just in a perfect way that would create this war. They were just set up to fail, and also the double dealing, which you talk about. He read a lot of Carroll Quigley to write the book, so a lot of what he writes about in the book is what you covered in your analysis of Tragedy and Hope, about the dual policy, about Edward VIII and all that scam and Alger Hiss and these things. That crazy thing, and how Hitler was lured to tricked into thinking that there was an element within the British establishment that was more sympathetic to the Nazis, when that was just a ruse to get him to go to war and constantly try to negotiate with the British Empire. And so, interesting book.
How do we tie it to Disney? Well, as I mentioned, actually there's a clear tie from Brzezinski. We can go directly from Brzezinski to Disney. How? Well, if you think about Between Two Ages, the whole book is about the model of what kind of New World Order Brzezinski sees coming.
Mm-hmm.
And what is a technocracy? Well, it's basically that older philosophy of, a kind of socialistic utopianism that foresaw technology being the salvation of humankind. So you can connect this to the Fabian socialists and these characters. You can tie it to Russian cosmist thinkers and science fiction writers and futurists, Berdyaev and these kind of characters. And what you get is the inevitable, predetermined juggernaut of technology leading man, to the stars and all this kind of propaganda baloney. And it kind of died out, but then I think what happened is that the Huxleys and the families of the Royal Society types, I think they were instrumental in really reviving it. And that's the milieu that you get with Brzezinski, who I think you could tie very, very closely to something like Brave New World. That's really what Brzezinski's outlining, is a Brave New World type of approach. I mean, he may not mention everything like cloning, but I mean, he's basically saying the same thing. So how do we get to Disney? Well, what Brzezinski sees is a completely controlled managerial society. And that's what the green agenda, the UN, COP22 or 2020, whatever it is, the plan to have for reorganized communities, megalopolises, all of these kinds of things that you hear conspiracy theorists talk about. That is what Disney was implementing as part of the conditioning process known as Epcot. So Epcot Center is actually the community of tomorrow. That was its original inception idea. And the idea was that, well, the future's coming. It's all going to be this tech utopia. It's this, this utopian futurism that we see in these different philosophers. And so we can project that cities will no longer be organized the way that city planning was done for, during, I guess, the periods of industrialism and capitalism. You're going to have a completely controlled, basically the AI supergrid smart city model. And this will be intimately tied into all of the green regulations. And so this is what Catherine Austin Fitts has talked about many times. Gentrification is a big part of this. This is 100% part of even though the, individual entrepreneurs may not know that their gentrification is tied to Agenda 21, what it does is that it rezones areas. Now, you've talked about zoning areas and how that's been used to destroy ethnic communities and, Catholic cultures and so forth. That was all zoning laws as models for what we're going to see in the future.
Yeah, and progressivism, democracy, integration, these things,
Yes. Now, what they're also doing that not many people have talked about, I think I heard Alan Watt talk about this, but I've looked it up, but it is true. They will try to buy off mayors in local communities.
I think that's been done already just to, Department of Homeland Security grants. What do you think that is?